Oseo.
Oseo.
It's a Cherokee greeting. Wave the great feather for the good of it. Hey, hey. Oh, here we are. We're on the eve of the vernal equinox, and that's my theme. It's going to be the vernal equinox at Chichen Itza. That's in Mexico. My previous few talks have been Egypt, and so just to say where that's coming from, my Egypt studies are grounded in my undergraduate college courses, and since that time other things have taken place in that field. There's been more scholarship. For one, African scholarship has been allowed into the field. Also, Martin Vernal's Placatina, revealed, the falsification of the Aryan model etymologies. And also, when I finished that, and then I was ready for my graduate program. And coincidentally, that my college had opened up a satellite campus in Mexico associated with the University of Morelia in Michoacan. I applied to that and I was accepted in that. And so I decided that I would do something on Mexico. A professor had written in my transcripts earlier, quote, his sympathies Mexican. That was a good cue. And nobody was doing that theme at all, so I kind of fished around to look for that. Some of my literary prompts would be Charles Olson, Mayan Letters, and Anton Artaud, Peyote Pilgrimage. Also, it had the Labyrinth of Solitude. That's Octavio Paz, and that became kind of my font for the philosophical aspect for the Mexican studies there. And so I had a student visa, and I rented a house in the village for $1.50 a month.
Oh, wow.
And then I could make forays from there. And also, the bookstore and library at Kroger Hall there at the University of California was one source, a major source, and a bookstore that we had in Mexico City. I say we in Mexico City because 1968 there was a student protest because the Olympics were being held at that time there, and people wanted to embarrass the government of Mexico, and they did it with a cost there. And so I went to the University of Mexico, and it was still under martial law, or as the National Guard was still there in 1969, so forth. So all of these things that took me into Mexico, and people at one point, I actually lived with a family there in Mexico City that were from Oaxaca, and with them we actually journeyed to Oaxaca, where I was able to visit some of the ancient ruins of the people who were there. Now, the Mexican Revolution was just over 100 years ago, and that very much, liberated. It liberated a lot. Surprisingly, although the government did arrest some of our teachers at our satellite campus there in 1968, but they didn't shut down the bookstore, which was the reason, because the protests seemed to the government have been prompted by sympathizers of Che Guevara. So those kind of things were also going on there. But I pretty much, I sailed through there. And while Chichen Itza is my main theme here, and then I'm going to point that out here, that this is a woven grass mat I've had for a few years and managed to keep it together there. And this marvelous painting on here of this is Chichen Itza. Chichen Itza is there in southern Mexico. It is a Mayan country of Yucatan there. The major city nearby would be Merida. And the name Chichen Itza really means the well. There's a cenote there, a big cenote there. A couple of times it's been dredged because it's a sacred thing and people for, who knows, centuries and centuries have been throwing things in there as offerings. I even myself have something from there. I didn't bring it today to show you. And so that's what it means. It means the Chichén is the well, Coyote. And the Itzá were a people post-Mayan who were no longer there. In other words, the Mayans first built this city, and then eventually they left it about 600 years later. And then another people came, some kind of Mexicans, and they called themselves the Itzá. And then another people came, and they call themselves the Tura, or the Turan. There. So one of those people built this here. And what it is notable for is they also call this the Temple of Quetzalcoatl. Let me tell you who's Quetzalcoatl, but basically meaning plumed serpent. Here on the Equinox, both Equinox spring and fall here, thousands of people. Now when I was there, only me and my schoolmate, Joe Lopez, had the whole place to herself. But now thousands and thousands of people go to attend this. It certainly is, you know, an auspicious and sacred site. Things definitely happen there. But the idea here that's attracting everybody is this serpent, meaning, you know, Quetzalcoatl, descends from heaven down into the temple surmounting the pyramid, and then the light and shadow play as the serpent is descending down the stairway, and then there are these massive like dragon head down there that becomes illuminated. And so this site, all in all, seems to have been deliberately conceived and organized as an astronomy site. And people definitely knew what they were doing when they planned these buildings here. Inside of the pyramid, we'll call it that, you know, there is a stone jaguar. There were, you could go around, they had discovered an opening inside of the pyramid, and there's this red stone jaguar with a turquoise sun on his back. So all of those things are featuring in there. As to Quetzalcoatl, well, I should say, if you can realize, you know, historically, that Egypt, when we call it ancient Egypt, well, about 2,000 years ago, it was pretty much, that was all it was, give or take 100 years either way. And then there in Mexico, you know, there's these pyramids, they call them Teotihuacan, meaning the place where the wondrous comes out. You know, down here in Balboa Park, there are reconstructions of Mayan buildings that you'll see these tiers. That's Huacan, meaning coming out, just like a bamboo or something comes out of itself. So Teo, meaning the marvelous, and Te, the place where the marvelous comes out. All of those kind of things. So these pyramids were less than 2,000 years ago. You know, basically its heyday was about 1,500 years ago to, you know, a little couple more 100 years like that. So you begin to realize that. Now my Egyptian studies quickly made me sensible to the presence of the Egyptians. And since it's been pretty well proved, the connection to the Mediterranean, to Mexico, and all of that. So we go back to Egypt and refer to Osiris. He's kind of the divine man there for all of Egypt. And then as Egypt began to decline and all that, then you had another character come up that is famously called Jesus Christ, and he's a redaction of Osiris here. And the Egyptian Copts, I should mention that, I've been 25 years with the Yaquis of Guadalupe, and they are descendants of Egyptian Copts. And the Egyptian in their culture was very evident to me. So you have that. And now, here in Mexico, 1,500 years ago, you have another edition of Osiris, Jesus Christ, now Quetzalcoatl. And here, over at Teotihuacan, I made this replica. I should say, those pyramids were only open in 1964. Again, with the Mexican Revolution and also the decipherment of the Egyptian hieroglyphs by the end of the 19th century, all these things coincided and opened up things like that. And so when the pyramids in Mexico were finally excavated, because otherwise they just looked like hills covered with dirt, and they excavated them and was opened there in 1964, that late. And there are many paintings, frescoes in there, and the Anthropology Museum in Mexico City has replicated a lot of these. So I could see them in both places there. I had rented a hotel room there in San Juan de Letrán, Mexico City, and I went to the museum daily and did drawings daily. In fact, when I was there in 1971, a rainstorm or something had opened up something in the Pyramid of the Sun, as they call it, and it opened up that there was a considerable chambers inside, tunnels and chambers, and photographs, I'm saying, there were paintings there of the pulque ceremony, and all of these were replicated in the newspaper there in Mexico City, and I had had that for a long time, quite a few photographs. So that all happened there in 1971, and I was first there in 1969. So I'm just, filling you in with all of this as these things begin to come to light, as you begin to see what these things are. Now, the earlier archaeologists had recognized the Egyptians, and whenever they tried to open their mouth on that, they were hushed up by the quote called the Americanists, who were pretty steeped in biblical ideas. So it took a long time for a lot of these things to loosen up. But Quetzalcoatl there is basically, another fellow, and this here I've replicated. This is I would guess, the first, quote, portrait of Quetzalcoatl, showing him as a bearded man. And that's from Teotihuacan here. And here, this mask is, of the various masks that I've had and do have, this is the most soulful carving. And you can see here is a little bird, and that's the Quetzal bird. He's a little bird with very, very long plumage, like that. And of course, the earlier people, they very much collected these feathers to make headdresses with it. And so all of that. This little story that I like about Quetzalcoatl goes down here to this. He is credited, among many, many wondrous things, with bringing maize, corn, to the Mexicans. And how he did that was somehow the grain of corn was in the possession of the red ants. So he changed himself into a black ant. And in that, he was able to get in there in the ant world, and that he stole the grain of corn from the red ants and brought it to the Mexicans. And that became the whole staff of life there. So I really, really like that guy there. And down here, this is a miniature figure of a character that's called Chocmol. And he's there at Chichen Itza. And here, this is a mini replica. There's a bowl, but actually on the real statue, it's not a bowl, it's a depression. And I sat there, I sat on. It is located on a truncated pyramid at Chichen Itza. This is called the Temple of the Warriors. And that there are 4 of these large pillars that are carved to kind of look like warriors. The interesting thing about it, pretty quickly, as the early archaeologists began to see Egypt here, those 4 pillars in that perspective are seen as the followers or sons of Horus, because they uphold the sky. And presumably there had been a roof or something there, but as they stand now, they do suggest that they are the followers of Horus upholding the sky. And so this was unearthed there in Mexico, and the archaeologist was Augustus Placonia, and he was going to enter this in the World's Fair Centennial in Philadelphia in 1886. But the Americans would have nothing of it. you were saying that Indians carved that, they wouldn't allow it. So it's a kind of a band figure, but I have it here to represent. Now the way he found it here, he had learned from a native Mayan how to read the hieroglyphs that were engraved there in Chichen Itza, and with that he found the name Chop Mu. Chop means Lord. Exactly what Mu is, I don't know. But they suppose that this was a figure from the earlier Tura people there. And that somehow he learned from that hieroglyph where this was hidden in the ground, and that he was able to dig there and get that out of there. So that's the general scope here for all of these things here. And I want to read a piece again to realize that these things, Egyptian history wasn't known until the end of the 19th century. And Mexico was under the restriction, I would say, of Spain and the Roman Catholic Church. And everything that went with that. So the revolution there, 1912 to 1917, was really against the Spanish colonial government bureaucracy in Mexico City, and also an interest to dislodge the Roman Catholic Church from Mexico. And there was a conflict for a while over that, and ended up with the church could be there, but it has restrictions on that. So to also realize that all of these things being liberated, there's still much that is held by the Spanish government in Spain and by the Roman Catholic Church that has not been released. And this would be the first English translation of, this is a saga of Quetzalcoatl. There are only two major documents that were somehow acquired by a couple of Catholic clergy in the Aztec time, or at the end of that, like that. And this comes, from called the Legend of the Five Sons. And this is the saga of Quetzalcoatl. There are similarities to the Egyptian Osiris, we won't go into it, and also the Cahuilla out here in the Azaborrego, their principal deity, Mucat, is very similar here in the saga of Quetzalcoatl. And I'm just going to read the very last part of that saga. When he reached the Holy See and the shore of the luminous ocean, he stayed his steps and wept. He gathered his garments together and dressed himself again in his robes of quetzal feathers and his turquoise mask. When he had dressed, he set his own body on fire and was consumed in flames. For this reason, the place where Quetzalcoatl burned is called the place of the stake. And it is well known that when he burned and his ashes rose up into the sky, all the fine feathered birds appeared to watch how they went aloft. The red feather, Gucamaya, the blue jay, the lovely thrush, the shining white bird, the parrots and parakeets with their yellow feathers, and all the other richly aplumed birds. When the ashes had ceased to burn, Quetzalcoatl's heart rose up. They say it was raised to heaven and entered there. The old men say it became the morning star which appears at dawn. And they say further that it was not seen for 4 days after his death, when he had gone to sojourn in the kingdom of the dead. And in these 4 days he gathered arrows, and 8 days later he appeared again as the great star. And it is well known that since that time he has always been upon his throne. Thus ends the epic of Quetzalcoatl, the king who fell into temptation, repented, committed the supreme sacrifice, and rose to become the planet Venus. He is the god who doled maize for men. He is the man who renounced sin and became God. He demonstrates that self-sacrifice is possible and that man can be purged by fire. Of all the gods, he is the one who has suffered as a human being and can sympathize deeply and personally with man. He is not so much God as divine man, who has won immortality and godliness through mortal struggle and against the odds of mortal weakness. And now, my friends, listen to the dream-filled word. Every spring, the golden corn revives us with its blossom, gives us light. The tender red corn makes us a necklace, and we know that the hearts of our friends are true. That's all. Muchas gracias.